The fire alarm went off during finals week, and then I got a text from my ex. I'm sorry for what's about to happen. The fire alarm ripped through the exam hall and I looked down at my phone. The message was from Declan, my ex-boyfriend, who I hadn't spoken to in 3 months. I'm sorry for what's about to happen. My hands started shaking. Professor Dalton was already shouting for everyone to evacuate, students grabbing backpacks and heading for exits. But I couldn't move. What did Declan mean? What was about to happen? I typed back with trembling fingers. What are you talking about? The 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. My heart hammered against my ribs. Around me, the room was emptying fast, the alarm shrieking without pause. My roommate Isla grabbed my shoulder hard enough to hurt, asking why I wasn't moving, what was wrong. I showed her the text and watched all the color drain from her face in an instant. She said we needed to leave right now, that whatever Declan was planning, we had to get out of this building immediately. Another text came through before I could stand up. I loved you, and you destroyed me. Now you'll understand what that feels like. Isla was pulling my arm, physically dragging me out of my seat toward the door. We joined the flood of students in the hallway, everyone moving in the same direction toward the stairs like a human river. That's when I smelled it. Smoke. Not the fake smell of a drill, but real smoke. Acrid and sharp, burning my nose and throat. The crowd started pushing harder, panic spreading like wildfire through the massive bodies. Isla's hand slipped from mine and suddenly there were 3 people between us. I tried to push through, but the crowd was too thick, too panicked, everyone shoving toward the exit. My phone buzzed again and I looked down while being carried along by the crowd. You're probably scared right now. Good. Now you know how I felt every day after you left. The smoke was getting thicker, curling along the ceiling in dark tendrils that looked wrong against the white tiles. I could hear fire alarms going off on multiple floors now, the sound overlapping and creating this disorienting wall of noise. This wasn't a drill. This was real. Declan had done something to the building. My ex-boyfriend, who I'd dated for 2 years, who I'd broken up with 3 months ago, had set fire to the building where I was taking my calculus final. The realization hit me like a physical blow and I stumbled, nearly falling, catching myself on someone's shoulder. We burst out into the quad and I immediately started scanning faces in the crowd, terrified that Declan might be here watching, that he might be anywhere. Students were coughing and pointing at smoke pouring from upper floor windows, dark plumes that looked like something out of a movie. Isla found me in the chaos and grabbed my shoulders with both hands, her nails digging into my skin through my shirt. She was asking if I still had my phone, if I'd gotten more messages, if I'd called the police yet. I shook my head, unable to form words, my brain stuck on those texts. I'm sorry for what's about to happen. You destroyed me. Now you'll understand. A campus security officer was nearby trying to organize the chaos, shouting instructions that no one was following. I pushed through the crowd toward her, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I showed her my phone screen with Declan's texts, and her expression changed instantly from annoyed to alarmed. She spoke urgently into her radio, words I couldn't quite hear over the noise of sirens that were already approaching. Within minutes, a man in plainclothes appeared next to us, a detective badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Detective Carver and asked me to tell him everything about Declan. Right now, every detail I could remember. His eyes were sharp and focused, scanning my face like he was reading something there. I tried to organize my thoughts, but they kept fragmenting, scattering like leaves in wind. I told him about the jealousy that had consumed Declan during our 2 years together, how it had started small and grown until it swallowed everything else. The way he'd check my location constantly through that app he'd insisted we both download. How he'd show up at my classes unannounced, sitting in the back row just watching me. The accusations of cheating whenever I talked to any guy, even my lab partners or study group members. The night 3 months ago when I'd come home to find him inside my apartment even though I'd never given him a key. He'd somehow convinced my landlord to let him in by claiming we lived together and I'd locked myself out. He'd cooked dinner, set the table with candles, expected me to be grateful for the surprise. But all I felt was violated, my private space invaded, my boundaries trampled. That's when I'd ended it, told him to leave, locked the door behind him. But it hadn't ended there. Detective Carver was taking rapid notes in a small notebook, his pen moving fast across the page. He asked if Declan had ever made specific threats, ever talked about violence or revenge. I said not directly, but he'd said things that seemed harmless at the time but now took on darker meanings. Things like, you'll regret this, and you'll be sorry when I'm gone, and I'll make sure you never forget me. At the time, I'd thought he meant he'd become successful, and I'd realized my mistake leaving him. Now those words felt like warnings I'd been too stupid or too scared to understand. I told the detective about the constant texting that first few weeks, sometimes 100 messages in a day, about blocking him and having him get new numbers, about the night 6 weeks ago when he'd shown up at my apartment building at 2 a.m, pounding on the main door until neighbors called the police. Detective Carver's radio crackled with a voice saying something about multiple points of origin. Definitely arson. Possibly accelerant used. Someone was reporting that the fire had started in 3 different locations simultaneously on different floors. My stomach lurched violently, and I thought I might vomit right there on the quad in front of everyone. Declan had done this. My ex-boyfriend, who used to make me breakfast in bed and leave cute notes in my textbooks, who'd cried when I'd gotten food poisoning and stayed up all night taking care of me, had set fire to a building full of students taking finals because I'd broken up with him. The cognitive dissonance was too much to process. These 2 versions of Declan couldn't exist in the same person, but clearly they did. More emergency vehicles were arriving now, fire trucks and ambulances and police cars forming a perimeter around the entire building. News vans were parking on the far side of the quad, reporters already setting up cameras and trying to interview students. The smoke was getting worse, and I could see flames visible in some of the upper floor windows now. Students around us were taking videos on their phones, posting to social media, texting their parents. The energy was shifting from confused to afraid, the reality settling in that this was serious, that people could have died. Detective Carver stepped away to take a call on his cell phone, spoke in low, urgent tones I couldn't hear, then came back with his expression even grimmer than before. He said they'd traced the text from my phone to a location about 3 miles from campus, that officers were being dispatched there right now. My phone rang, the sound cutting through everything else. Declan's name on the screen. My hand froze, unable to answer or decline, just staring at his name while the phone kept ringing. The detective immediately said, "Don't answer it, let me handle this." He took my phone from my shaking hand and answered on speaker, his voice calm and professional as he identified himself as Detective Carver with campus police. There was silence on the other end of the line, just the sound of breathing. Then Declan's voice came through, slurred and strange in a way I'd never heard before. "Where's Whitney? She should be answering her own phone. Why are you answering Whitney's phone?" The detective said I'd asked him to intervene on my behalf, that we were trying to understand the situation and help resolve it peacefully. Declan laughed, a bitter sound that made my skin crawl. Of course she did. Always running away, always getting someone else to fix her problems for her. Never had the guts to face me herself. His words were slurring together slightly, like he was drunk or on something. Detective Carver kept his voice steady, asking Declan where he was right now, saying they could talk about whatever was happening, that there were always solutions to problems if people could just communicate. Declan said there was nothing to resolve, that it was already done, that I'd have to live with what I'd caused for the rest of my life. The way he said it made my blood run cold, like he was reading from a script he'd prepared, like he'd been practicing these words. I wanted to grab the phone and scream at him that I hadn't caused anything, that he'd made his own choices. But Isla held my arm tightly, and the detective shot me a warning look that said, "Stay quiet." Detective Carver kept talking to Declan in that same steady, measured voice, asking questions designed to keep him engaged. Asked if Declan was safe, if he was hurt, if he needed medical attention. Another officer was standing close by with his own radio, speaking quietly into it, presumably coordinating with whoever was trying to trace the call. Declan said he was exactly where he needed to be, watching everything unfold, watching everything Whitney cared about turn to ash. His voice was eerily calm now, like he'd moved past whatever emotion had been driving him and reached some kind of acceptance or peace with what he'd done. He said he'd been planning this for weeks, that every day since the breakup had been about getting to this moment, this perfect moment where I'd finally understand what he'd been feeling. He said I'd taken everything from him when I left. His purpose in life, his future plans, his reason for existing. He'd tried to move on but couldn't. Tried to forget me, but I was in every single thought, waking and sleeping. Every woman he saw reminded him of me. Every song on the radio was about us. Every place he went, we'd been there together. He couldn't escape me, so why should I get to escape him? Setting fire to the building where we'd met freshman year, where we'd taken so many classes together, where I'd chosen to spend my time instead of with him, felt like the only appropriate response. The logic was twisted and insane, but he spoke like he'd thought it through rationally, like he'd weighed options and come to this conclusion deliberately. The detective asked about Declan's family, trying to find something to anchor him to reality. Asked if he'd talked to his parents, if they knew where he was. Declan said his parents had disowned him after he'd dropped out last semester, that they'd called him a failure and told him not to come home until he got his life together. Said his friends had all abandoned him when I'd supposedly spread lies about him being controlling and abusive. I'd barely told anyone the real reasons we broke up, had kept it mostly private out of embarrassment and some misguided sense of protecting his reputation. But in Declan's mind, I'd apparently orchestrated this massive campaign to destroy his social life and turn everyone against him. The delusion was complete and terrifying in its conviction. Detective Carver's radio crackled again with a voice saying, "Units at Maple Street, suspect vehicle located in driveway, preparing to approach." The detective kept his expression neutral, not letting on that officers were closing in on Declan's location. He kept asking questions, kept Declan talking about his feelings and his grievances and what he hoped to accomplish with all this. Declan said he hoped I'd never be able to look at this campus again without remembering today, without seeing flames and smoke and knowing it was my fault. He wanted this memory burned into my brain forever, wanted me to carry the guilt of everyone who got hurt, wanted me to know that breaking up with him had consequences. The detective asked if Declan had thought about the legal consequences for himself, about what would happen when this was over. Declan said he didn't care about legal consequences, that prison couldn't be worse than the prison he'd been living in for the past 3 months without me. Said at least in actual prison, people would know why he was suffering, would acknowledge his pain as real. The rationalization was so twisted it made my head hurt trying to follow it. Then the call cut off suddenly, just dead air. Detective Carver tried calling back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again with the same result. He told the officer with the radio to get an update on the Maple Street situation right now. We stood there in horrible silence that felt like it lasted hours but was probably only minutes, while smoke continued pouring from the building behind us, and fire trucks aimed water at the flames. The officer's radio finally crackled with an update. Subject in custody, no resistance, 1 male secured. Detective Carver let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was over. Declan was caught. My legs went weak and Isla caught me before I could fall, her arm around my waist holding me upright. The detective said we still needed to go to the station for my formal statement, that this was far from over even though the immediate threat was neutralized. Declan wasn't going anywhere for a very long time. Arson, terroristic threats, reckless endangerment of multiple people, probably a dozen other charges once they finished investigating. He'd be lucky to see freedom again before he was 50 years old. The thought should have brought relief, but instead I just felt hollow, like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything important. Dean Morrison appeared with a counselor from Student Services, a woman named Ramona who had kind eyes and spoke in a soft voice. She said she'd accompany me to the police station, that I wouldn't have to do any of this alone. Isla insisted on coming too, said nothing in the world would keep her from being there with me. We walked across campus in this surreal procession, past students who were still standing around in groups looking shocked, past news crews who were filming their segments about the tragedy, past the emergency vehicles that had completely transformed our familiar university into something that looked like a war zone. I kept my head down, not wanting to see the curious stares or the phone cameras that might be recording me. By tomorrow, this would be all over the news. By tomorrow, everyone would know my name and my face and my history with Declan. The police station was a short walk from campus, a squat brick building that I'd passed hundreds of times without ever thinking I'd go inside. Detective Carver led us through the main entrance and down a hallway to an interview room that was exactly like the ones on TV shows. Plain and institutional, with a table and chairs bolted to the floor and a camera mounted in the corner. He said the interview would be recorded for evidence purposes, that I should answer his questions as completely and honestly as possible, that I could take breaks whenever I needed them. Ramona and Isla sat against the wall, there for moral support but not participating in the actual interview. The detective started with basic information, establishing my identity and my connection to the case. My full name, date of birth, current address, major and year in school. Then he moved into the relationship history, and this is where it got hard. When did I first meet Declan? Freshman orientation week, we'd both been in the same welcome group and hit it off immediately. When did we start dating? About a month into first semester, after hanging out in a group a few times, and then him asking me to dinner. When did I first notice problematic behaviors? That was harder to pin down because it had been so gradual. Maybe 3 months in when he'd gotten upset about me going to a party without him. Or maybe 6 months in when he'd started checking my location constantly and questioning why I'd been somewhere different than I'd told him. I walked through it chronologically, each answer feeling like I was building a case against my own judgment for staying with someone who showed so many warning signs. Detective Carver asked about specific incidents, and I found myself recounting memories I'd tried to bury. The time Declan had showed up at my dorm at 3 a.m. because I hadn't responded to his text for 2 hours, and he was convinced something terrible had happened to me. The time he'd gone through my phone while I was sleeping and confronted me about messages from my lab partner Marcus, who he was convinced I was cheating with despite Marcus having a serious girlfriend. The time at a party when Declan had grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises when I tried to walk away during an argument. The time he'd followed me to my friend's house and sat in his car outside for hours just watching to make sure I was really where I said I'd be. Each memory was like pressing on a bruise, painful in a way I'd tried to ignore by simply not thinking about any of it. The detective's expression stayed neutral, but I could see him taking detailed notes, his pen moving rapidly across the page. He asked about the physical violence specifically, whether Declan had ever hit me or physically restrained me. I said he'd never hit me exactly, but he'd grabbed me, pushed me, locked doorways so I couldn't leave, taken my phone so I couldn't call for help. Once he'd driven erratically with me in the car, swerving and speeding, because we were arguing and he said if I didn't stop yelling at him, he'd crash the car and we'd both die. I'd been terrified that night, genuinely thought we might not survive. But the next day he'd apologized so profusely, brought me flowers and chocolate, said he'd been having a panic attack and lost control. I'd forgiven him because I was 19 and didn't know any better. Detective Carver asked about the actual breakup, what had finally pushed me to end it after 2 years. I described coming back to my apartment that night 3 months ago and finding Declan inside even though I'd never given him a key. He'd talked the landlord into letting him in by spinning some story about us living together and me being locked out. He'd cooked this elaborate dinner, bought wine, set the table with candles like it was some romantic gesture. But all I could think about was that he'd violated my space, that he'd crossed yet another boundary, that I couldn't trust him with even the most basic concept of my apartment being mine alone. I'd looked at him standing there in my kitchen expecting gratitude, and something inside me had just snapped. I told him it was over, that we were done, that I needed him to leave immediately and not come back. He'd cycled through every emotion possible in the span of an hour, begging me to reconsider, crying and saying he couldn't live without me. Then anger, yelling that I was ungrateful and selfish. Then bargaining, promising he'd change, he'd give me space, he'd do whatever I wanted. Then threats, saying he'd hurt himself if I really meant this, that his blood would be on my hands. I'd held firm through all of it, kept telling him to leave, eventually having to physically push him toward the door. He'd finally left around midnight, and I'd locked the door and immediately called the landlord to demand the locks be changed. That should have been the end of our story, but clearly it was just the beginning of something much worse. Detective Carver asked about everything that happened after the breakup, all the contact Declan had tried to maintain despite me making it clear I wanted nothing to do with him, the constant texting, sometimes 50 messages in a day. I'd blocked his number and he'd gotten a new phone and started texting from that. Blocked that one and he'd use apps that let you text from different numbers. He'd message me on Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, every social media platform I had. I'd blocked him on all of them and he'd create new accounts. He'd email me from multiple addresses. He'd leave notes on my car windshield. He'd show up at my classes and sit in the back row just watching me until professors noticed and had security escort him out. He'd contacted my friends asking about me, showing up at their apartments or workplace. The harassment had been relentless for about 6 weeks, then had seemed to taper off. The messages became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I hadn't seen him around campus in over a month. I'd stupidly thought he'd finally moved on, finally accepted that we were over and started building his own life separately. Now I understood he'd just been planning this, channeling all that obsessive energy into something much darker than unwanted texts. He'd been researching the building, figuring out the best places to start fires, timing his attack for finals week when he knew I'd be in there taking exams. The level of calculation required was chilling. This wasn't a spontaneous act of passion. This was methodical and deliberate. The detective asked if I'd saved any of the messages, any of the evidence of harassment. I said yes. I had screenshots on my phone from before I'd blocked his original number. Emails saved in a folder I'd labeled just in case, though I'd never articulated what I thought I might need them for. Notes he'd left on my car that I'd photographed before throwing away. I pulled out my phone and started forwarding everything to the email address Detective Carver gave me. It took over 10 minutes to send it all. Message after message showing the progression from, I miss you, to, you'll regret this, to, you destroyed my life. The detective watched his own phone as the messages came through, his jaw tightening as he read through them. The interview lasted over 3 hours. By the end, my voice was completely hoarse from talking, and my head was pounding with the worst headache I'd ever experienced. Detective Carver said I'd done extremely well, that my testimony would be crucial in building the prosecution's case against Declan. He said the district attorney would likely be in touch within the next few days, that I should expect to be called as a witness when this went to trial. The word trial made everything feel horribly, irreversibly real. This wasn't going to be resolved quietly. This would be public and drawn out. Months or even years of legal proceedings. My entire relationship with Declan examined and dissected by lawyers and judges and possibly a jury of strangers. Ramona said the university would provide support throughout the entire process, that victim advocacy services were available, that counseling was free and confidential. We finally left the police station as the sun was setting, the day having somehow stretched on forever despite feeling like only minutes had passed. Isla insisted I come back to our apartment rather than being alone, and I didn't have the energy to argue, even though part of me wanted to disappear into solitude. Ramona gave me her business card and made me promise to call if I needed anything at any hour, emphasized that the counseling center had extended hours during finals week. I took the card mechanically, knowing I should probably use those services but unable to imagine sitting in a therapist's office trying to explain how I felt when I didn't understand it myself. The guilt and relief and anger and confusion were all tangled together until I couldn't separate one emotion from another. Our apartment was 3 blocks from campus in a dated complex that mostly housed students. Isla unlocked the door and we stepped into the familiar space that somehow felt completely different now. She went straight to the kitchen and started making tea, the ritual of it soothing even though I didn't think I could actually drink anything. My phone kept buzzing constantly with texts and calls from people who'd heard what happened. Friends checking if I was okay, my parents demanding I call them immediately, acquaintances from classes I barely knew offering sympathy, news notifications about the fire popping up every few minutes with updated casualty counts and damage estimates. I turned the phone face down on the counter, unable to deal with any of it, the screen still lighting up with each new notification like a strobe light. Isla brought me tea in my favorite mug, and we sat on the couch without talking for a long time. The silence felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. She'd been my roommate for 2 years, and my friend even longer. She'd met Declan plenty of times, had even liked him at first before his controlling tendencies became too obvious to ignore. She'd been the one to tell me I deserved better, that his jealousy wasn't romantic or caring, that his need to know my location every single moment wasn't protective but possessive. I wished desperately that I'd listened to her sooner. Wished I'd ended it freshman year when the red flags first appeared. Wished I'd reported him to campus police when he started showing up at my classes uninvited. Wished I'd done 100 different things that might have somehow prevented today from happening. The news was showing aerial footage of the building now. Flames mostly contained, but the damage obvious even from the sky. The ticker at the bottom of the screen scrolled constant updates. No fatalities reported, which felt like a miracle. 17 students treated for smoke inhalation at local hospitals. Building structurally compromised, possibly a total loss. Investigation ongoing. Suspect in custody. They showed a brief clip of Declan being led out of a house in handcuffs, his head down, his expression completely blank. He looked so much smaller than I remembered, less threatening. Just a 21-year-old kid who'd made catastrophic choices that would define the rest of his life. The reporter was calling it one of the most serious incidents of domestic terrorism on a college campus in recent years. Domestic terrorism. The phrase felt absurd applied to my ex-boyfriend who used to make me breakfast and leave cute notes in my textbooks. But it was accurate. He'd used violence and threats to achieve a goal, in this case punishing me for leaving him and making sure I'd never forget him. Isla finally broke the silence, asking carefully if I wanted to talk about it, or if I needed space to process everything alone. I said I honestly didn't know, that nothing felt real yet, that part of me kept expecting to wake up and realize this was just a particularly vivid stress dream brought on by finals anxiety. She said her psychology professor would probably diagnose me with acute shock, that I should expect weird and unpredictable emotional reactions over the next few days and weeks. That trauma didn't follow a logical timeline or process the way people expected it to. That healing would be messy and nonlinear, and I shouldn't judge myself for however I ended up handling this. I nodded like I understood what she meant, but understanding something intellectually and actually feeling it emotionally were two completely different things. My phone rang again, my mom's number lighting up the screen. I couldn't avoid her forever, much as I wanted to. I answered and immediately heard her crying hysterically on the other end, asking if I was safe, asking if I was hurt, demanding to know exactly what happened. I gave her the abbreviated version, leaving out the worst details because I couldn't handle her reaction to the full story. She wanted to drive down immediately, to bring me home, to pull me out of school entirely, and keep me close where she could protect me from everything. I told her I couldn't leave right now, that I'd need to be here for the investigation and probably the trial, that running away wouldn't actually help anything. She argued but eventually accepted it when I started crying, made me promise to call her every single day, made me swear I'd go to counseling and take care of myself. I agreed to everything just to get off the phone, completely exhausted by the effort of reassuring other people that I was okay when I so clearly wasn't. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw smoke and flames and Declan's name on my phone screen. Heard his voice on that call saying I'd destroyed him, that this was my fault, that I'd have to live with the guilt forever. The rational part of my brain knew his choices were his own, that nothing I'd done justified setting a building on fire. But the irrational part, the part shaped by 2 years of his manipulation, wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe if I'd just stayed with him, endured his jealousy and control, none of this would have happened. Maybe those 17 students wouldn't have been hurt. Maybe that building would still be standing. The guilt was crushing even though I knew logically it made no sense. Campus was still in lockdown the next morning. Crime scene tape surrounded the burned building, investigators in white hazmat suits moving in and out documenting evidence. Classes were canceled for the rest of the week. Finals postponed indefinitely. Students were leaving campus early for winter break, their parents driving up to collect them, everyone eager to put physical distance between themselves and the trauma. Isla's parents called wanting her to come home immediately, but she refused, said she wouldn't abandon me to deal with this alone. I told her to go, that I'd be fine, that she shouldn't ruin her own break because of my problems. But she was adamant, said we'd survived it together and we'd get through the aftermath together. Her loyalty made me cry, one of many times I'd cry over the next few days, as the shock gradually wore off and the full reality of what happened began to sink in. Detective Carver called that afternoon with updates on the investigation. They'd executed a search warrant on Declan's apartment and found extensive evidence of planning. Detailed maps of the building with evacuation routes carefully marked, photographs of every exit and fire alarm location, pages of research printed from the internet about accelerants and how to create maximum structural damage with minimal resources. Receipts showing he'd purchased supplies weeks ago had been methodically preparing for this attack over an extended period of time. It wasn't some spontaneous act of passion or mental break. It was calculated and premeditated, which would work heavily against him in any legal proceedings. The detective said this evidence made it impossible for Declan to claim temporary insanity or diminished capacity. The district attorney's office was pursuing multiple felony charges, including aggravated arson, multiple counts of terroristic threatening, reckless endangerment of dozens of people, stalking with credible threat of harm. Each charge carried significant prison time. Declan would likely attempt to plead not guilty by reason of mental defect, trying to argue that depression or some other condition had impaired his judgment, and he hadn't been in full control of his actions. But the evidence of weeks of detailed planning would make that defense extremely difficult to sustain. Any decent prosecutor would tear it apart. The detective's tone suggested he thought Declan was looking at decades in prison, possibly 25 years or more depending on how the charges were combined and whether they ran consecutively or concurrently. I asked about the other students, whether anyone had been seriously hurt beyond the smoke inhalation cases. Detective Carver said most of the injuries had been relatively minor, thank God. Lots of smoke inhalation cases that required hospital observation but would heal completely. One girl had broken her ankle badly during the evacuation, would need surgery. A professor in his 60s had suffered a heart attack during the chaos but had survived after emergency treatment. A few students had panic attacks severe enough to require sedation, but it could have been catastrophically worse. If the fire alarms hadn't functioned properly, if Declan had been more successful in blocking exits, if the fire department had arrived even a few minutes later, we could be talking about fatalities. The thought of all those lives hanging in the balance because of my relationship choices made me physically ill. I spent the next half hour in the bathroom vomiting while Isla sat on the floor next to me, rubbing my back and not saying anything because there was nothing anyone could say that would make this remotely better. When I finally stopped heaving, she helped me to my bedroom and made me lie down with a cold washcloth on my forehead. She said I needed to eat something, but I couldn't imagine keeping food down. My stomach felt permanently twisted into knots, my whole body tense with anxiety that had nowhere to go. I lay there staring at my ceiling and thinking about those 17 students who'd been hurt because of me, thinking about their parents getting phone calls about the fire, thinking about how their lives had been disrupted by someone's obsession with me. The university released an official statement that evening calling the incident a tragedy and promising a comprehensive review of all safety protocols. They offered expanded counseling services and academic accommodations for any affected students. The statement was carefully worded by lawyers, expressing concern without admitting any liability or fault. My professors started emailing saying I could take my finals at a later date, or accept a grade based on my coursework so far, whichever I preferred. Most of them offered the latter option immediately, and I accepted without hesitation, unable to imagine sitting down to complete a calculus exam after everything that had happened. My GPA seemed profoundly unimportant now, a concern from a different lifetime when the biggest problem in my world had been proving a theorem correctly. News crews set up camp outside our apartment building, trying to ambush residents for interviews. I stopped leaving the apartment entirely, ordering all my food through delivery apps, and letting Isla handle anything that required going outside. She became my buffer against the world, screening my calls and messages, deciding what information I actually needed to know, and what could wait or be ignored entirely. My parents kept calling multiple times a day, my mom especially, consumed with worry and desperately wanting me to come home where she could take care of me. I told them I couldn't face the questions and pity and gossip from people in my small hometown, that staying in the relative anonymity of the university felt safer, even though it was only 2 miles from where everything had happened. They didn't really understand, but they stopped pushing after a few days. A week after the fire, Declan's preliminary hearing was scheduled at the county courthouse. Detective Carver said I didn't technically have to attend, but my presence in the courtroom might be impactful, might help the judge understand the human cost of Declan's actions beyond just property damage and medical bills. I agreed to go, partly because I felt some obligation to participate in the legal process, and partly because some dark part of me wanted to see Declan, wanted to look him in the eye and try to understand how someone I'd loved and trusted could do something like this. Isla came with me, and we sat in the courtroom gallery with Ramona from Student Services, who'd become an almost constant presence in my life over the past week. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from TV shows, institutional and cold with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. They brought Declan in wearing an orange county jail jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him connected to a chain around his waist. He looked absolutely terrible, hollow-eyed and gaunt, like he'd lost 15 pounds in a week. His hair had grown out and was unkempt, hanging in his eyes. When his gaze swept across the gallery and found mine, something flickered across his expression that I couldn't quite read. Recognition, definitely. Maybe regret. Possibly defiance. I wanted him to mouth an apology, to show some visible sign of remorse that might make any of this make sense. But his face settled back into careful blankness as his public defender, a tired-looking woman in an ill-fitting suit, guided him to the defendant's table and whispered instructions in his ear. The judge, an older man with silver hair and reading glasses, read the charges in a monotone voice. The list took several minutes to get through. Arson in the first degree, multiple counts of terroristic threatening, reckless endangerment of 43 persons, stalking with credible threat of serious harm, violation of a no-contact order I didn't even know had been issued, criminal mischief for the property damage. Each charge carried years of potential prison time. Added together, Declan was looking at potentially the rest of his life behind bars. The public defender entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf, which wasn't surprising. She immediately launched into an argument that Declan was suffering from severe untreated mental illness, that his actions were the direct result of a psychological break with reality, that he needed psychiatric hospitalization and treatment rather than criminal punishment. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman named Eleanor Fisk, countered aggressively. She presented the evidence of planning, the maps and research and supplies purchased weeks in advance. She read excerpts from the texts Declan had sent me, making them sound even more menacing than they'd felt in the moment. She described the terror of students trapped in a burning building during finals week. She argued that this was a calculated act of revenge by someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had deliberately chosen to endanger dozens of innocent people to punish his ex-girlfriend. The judge listened to both sides with an impassive expression, taking occasional notes on a legal pad in front of him. When it came time to set bail, the public defender asked for reasonable bail given Declan's clean prior record and strong family ties to the community. Prosecutor Fisk argued strenuously against any bail, citing the extreme danger Declan posed to me specifically and to the community generally. She pointed out that he'd already violated no-contact orders, that he'd proven himself willing to harm innocent people, that releasing him would put me and others at serious risk. The judge seemed to agree. He set bail at $750,000 cash, an amount that Declan's middle-class family could never hope to raise. Declan would remain in county jail pending trial, which could be months or even over a year away depending on court schedules and legal maneuvering. As the bailiffs moved to escort him out, Declan turned and looked directly at me one more time. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear across the distance of the courtroom. It might have been, "I'm sorry," or "I love you," or "I hate you," or something else entirely. Then he was gone through the side door. Outside the courthouse, reporters immediately swarmed us, microphones and cameras thrust in our faces from every direction. Questions came rapid fire, overlapping and aggressive. What was your relationship with the defendant? How long had you been dating? Did you know he was planning this? Did you see warning signs you ignored? How do you feel about the students who were hurt? Do you feel responsible for what happened? That last question hit me like a punch to the stomach, knocking the air out of my lungs. Ramona immediately stepped between me and the cameras, her arms spread wide, telling them forcefully to back off, that I had no comment and they needed to respect my privacy. But the question echoed in my head for days and weeks afterward, impossible to shake. Did I feel responsible? The honest answer was yes, even though logically I knew I shouldn't, even though everyone kept telling me Declan's choices were his own. Therapy stopped being optional and became mandatory. The university required counseling for all students who'd been directly affected by the fire, partly out of genuine concern, and partly as liability protection in case anyone tried to sue later. I was assigned to Dr. Patricia Reeves, a woman in her 50s who specialized in domestic violence and intimate partner abuse. Twice a week I sat in her comfortable office with its soft lighting and overstuffed chairs, picking apart my relationship with Declan piece by piece, examining all the warning signs I'd missed or ignored or rationalized away, processing the trauma of that day, the texts and the smoke and the guilt. Dr. Reeves helped me understand that abuse existed on a spectrum, that what I'd experienced absolutely counted as abuse, even though Declan had never hit me with a closed fist, even though the violence had been mostly psychological rather than physical. She explained concepts like coercive control and emotional manipulation, gave me vocabulary for things I'd experienced but never had words to describe. The way Declan had isolated me from friends by making them feel uncomfortable around us, the way he'd controlled my schedule and location through that tracking app and constant check-ins, the way he'd made me feel responsible for his emotions, like if he was unhappy or anxious, it was my job to fix it, the way he'd alternated between love bombing and withdrawal, keeping me constantly off balance and working for his approval. Dr. Reeves said these were all classic abuse tactics, that my experience was valid and real even if it didn't match the dramatic examples shown in movies and TV shows. That understanding helped, but it didn't erase the guilt. The trial was scheduled for 7 months away, giving both legal teams time to build their cases and complete discovery. Prosecutor Fisk started meeting with me regularly to prepare my testimony, walking me through exactly what to expect in court. She warned me that the defense would try their hardest to paint me as the villain in this story, the cruel heartbreaker who'd driven Declan to desperation and mental breakdown. They'd bring up every argument we'd ever had, every time I'd talked to another guy, every perceived slight or hurt that might somehow justify his reaction. She said I needed to stay calm and factual no matter what they threw at me, not let them provoke me into emotional responses that could be twisted and used against me. The preparation was absolutely exhausting, forcing me to relive the relationship over and over, but Ms. Fisk said strong testimony from me could make the difference between conviction and acquittal. Isla and I decided to move to a different apartment for the spring semester, somewhere without the memories of that day, somewhere the news crews couldn't find us as easily. We found a place on the opposite side of campus, farther from the burned building, in a complex that was mostly graduate students who minded their own business. I changed my phone number for the third time and deleted every single social media account I had, tired of the constant messages from strangers who felt entitled to share their opinions about what I should have done differently. My parents wanted me to transfer to a different university entirely, to start fresh somewhere without all this baggage. But I refused stubbornly, determined not to let Declan take my education away from me too. Staying felt like defiance, like proof that he hadn't won, that he couldn't control my life anymore even from jail. But every single day on campus was incredibly hard. Walking past the ruins of the burned building that still stood like a monument to that day, the university hadn't torn it down yet because the investigation was still technically ongoing. Every time I went to class, I'd see students staring at me, whispering to each other. Everyone knew who I was now, the girl whose crazy ex-boyfriend had set fire to a building. Some people were sympathetic. Others seemed to blame me somehow, like I should have prevented this, like I'd brought it on the whole campus by my choice in boyfriends. The weight of their judgment, real or imagined, was crushing. I started skipping classes I didn't absolutely need to attend, doing as much coursework online as possible, avoiding campus whenever I could. Winter break came and I went home to my parents' house for 3 weeks, grateful for the escape from campus and the constant reminders. But being home brought its own challenges. My mom wanted to talk about everything constantly, processing it out loud in a way that exhausted me. My dad didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, just looked at me with this combination of pity and concern that made me want to hide in my room. Friends from high school reached out wanting to meet up, but I couldn't face their questions and gossip. I spent most of break in my childhood bedroom, reading books and watching TV shows, existing in a numb state that felt safer than engaging with reality. My parents tiptoed around me like I was made of glass that might shatter at any moment. Going back to campus for spring semester felt both terrifying and necessary. Isla and I settled into our new apartment, deliberately creating routines that had nothing to do with the old place or the old life. New coffee shop for our morning caffeine. New route to campus that avoided the burned building entirely. New study spots in different libraries. We were trying to build a life that existed separately from the trauma, though of course it bled through into everything anyway. I'd see someone with Declan's build or hair color across the quad, and my heart would start racing before my rational brain could remind me he was in jail. I'd hear a fire alarm during a drill and have to leave the building immediately, unable to tolerate that sound without my chest getting tight and my breathing going shallow. The trial date got pushed back twice due to procedural delays and defense motions. Finally, it was scheduled to begin on a Monday in April, almost exactly 6 months after the fire. The weekend before, I barely slept, anxiety building until I felt like I might vibrate out of my skin. Isla stayed up with me, both of us watching mindless TV shows and eating junk food, not talking about what was coming because there was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said 100 times. Monday morning arrived too soon. The courthouse steps were absolutely packed with reporters and protesters. Some people were holding signs supporting Declan, calling him a victim of mental illness who needed help, not prison. Others held signs supporting me and the other affected students, calling for maximum sentences. Everyone seemed so convinced they understood the situation based on news coverage and social media posts. Ms. Fisk guided me through a side entrance to avoid the cameras, taking me to a witness waiting room where I'd stay until called to testify. The room was small and windowless, with uncomfortable plastic chairs and a coffee maker that produced something barely recognizable as coffee. Isla and my mom had both driven up for this, both of them nervous on my behalf. We sat there for hours, waiting, the anticipation somehow worse than the actual testimony would be. Finally, late afternoon on the second day of trial, they called me. My legs felt unsteady walking through the corridors to the courtroom. The gallery was absolutely packed with people I didn't know. Strangers who'd come to watch this trial like it was entertainment, like my trauma was a show for their consumption. Declan sat at the defense table flanked by his lawyers, staring down at the table rather than looking at me. He'd lost even more weight during his months in jail, his cheekbones sharp, his jail jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame. I was sworn in and took the witness stand, placing my shaking hands carefully on the arms of the chair to try to control their trembling. Ms. Fisk approached with a kind smile, starting with easy questions designed to help me settle in and establish my credibility for the jury. My name, age, major, year in school, how I knew the defendant, when we'd dated. She moved gradually into harder territory, asking me to describe specific instances of Declan's controlling behavior during our relationship, to explain how the jealousy had escalated over time, to recount the incidents of harassment after our breakup. I answered each question as clearly and factually as I could, trying to stay calm like she'd coached me during all those preparation sessions. But my voice kept cracking, especially when describing the scarier moments. The defense attorneys objected constantly, trying to disrupt my testimony and throw me off balance, making technical arguments about relevance and hearsay that the judge mostly overruled. When Ms. Fisk asked me to read aloud the text Declan had sent the day of the fire, my voice completely broke on, "I'm sorry for what's about to happen." She had me read several others, building a clear timeline of escalating threats and manipulation. The jury listened with intense focus, some of them taking notes, all of them watching my face carefully. I felt completely exposed and vulnerable, every emotion visible to these 12 strangers, who would ultimately decide Declan's fate. Then came cross-examination, and this was what I'd been dreading. Declan's defense attorney, a man named Leonard Walsh, with a reputation for aggressive tactics, approached me with barely concealed hostility radiating off him. He started by asking about arguments I'd had with Declan during our relationship, trying to establish that I'd been a difficult girlfriend. Asked me to recount times when I'd yelled at him or said hurtful things during fights. Asked detailed questions about other guys I'd talked to or spent time with, clearly trying to establish that I'd given Declan reasonable cause for jealousy. Asked if I'd ever considered that my actions and choices had contributed directly to Declan's mental breakdown. Ms. Fisk objected strenuously, and the judge sustained it. But the question hung in the air anyway, planting seeds of doubt. Walsh showed the jury emails I'd sent Declan during happier times in our relationship, cheerful messages about how much I loved him and how lucky I felt to have him. He pointed out that I'd seemed perfectly happy in photos from that period, that witnesses would testify I'd never complained about the relationship to friends or family. He suggested that maybe I was exaggerating the abuse now, rewriting our history to avoid taking responsibility for my role in what happened. The implication was clear. If I'd been a better girlfriend, if I'd been more understanding of Declan's needs, if I'd communicated better or tried harder to make things work, none of this would have happened. The victim blaming was obvious and offensive, but I could see some jury members nodding slightly, at least considering his arguments. I managed to stay relatively calm through most of the cross-examination, keeping my answers short and sticking to facts rather than emotions. But when Walsh asked directly if I felt guilty about the 17 students who'd been hurt in the fire, about the hundreds of thousands of dollars in property damage, about the professor who'd had a heart attack, something inside me finally broke. I said yes, I felt guilty every single day, that I woke up thinking about those students and went to sleep thinking about them, that the guilt was suffocating and constant and would probably never fully go away. Walsh smiled triumphantly like I'd just handed him exactly what he wanted, like my guilt somehow proved his point that I bore real responsibility for Declan's actions. But Ms. Fisk was ready on redirect. She asked me to explain carefully why I felt guilty, to walk the jury through my thought process. I took a deep breath and said I felt guilty because I wished I'd done more to protect those students. Wished I'd reported Declan's harassment to police earlier instead of just blocking his numbers. Wished I'd seen the warning signs of what he was planning. Wished I'd somehow prevented this tragedy. But feeling guilty didn't mean I was actually guilty. Didn't mean I'd caused Declan to make the choices he made. Declan had decided to spend weeks planning this attack. Declan had decided to buy supplies and research the building. Declan had decided to set multiple fires knowing students were inside taking exams. Those were all his choices, his decisions, his actions. Blaming me for them was just another form of the abuse and control he'd exercised throughout our relationship. The trial continued for 3 full weeks, feeling like it would never end. Other witnesses testified about the fire itself, about the panic during evacuation, about the damage and the injuries. Expert witnesses discussed arson patterns and accelerant use, explained how the fires had been deliberately set to cause maximum harm. Psychiatrists evaluated Declan's mental state, the defense's experts claiming severe depression and dissociative disorder, the prosecution's experts arguing he'd been fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Declan himself never took the stand, his lawyers deciding his testimony would likely do more harm than good given his tendency towards self-justification and blame-shifting. They were probably right about that. The jury finally began deliberations on a Friday afternoon. They deliberated through the weekend, which everyone said was unusual and could mean anything. Ms. Fisk tried to prepare me for the possibility of acquittal or hung jury, said we'd have to be ready for any outcome even though she felt confident in the case. Monday morning, they came back with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Every single charge. The courtroom erupted in reactions, some people crying with relief, others shouting in protest. Declan showed absolutely no visible reaction when the verdict was read, just continued staring straight ahead with that blank expression he'd worn throughout the trial. The judge thanked the jury for their service and set a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks later, warning everyone in the courtroom that outbursts would not be tolerated. Ms. Fisk squeezed my shoulder and said quietly that we'd won, that justice had been served, that this was the best possible outcome. But it didn't feel like winning at all. It felt like everyone had lost something irreplaceable and irrecoverable. Declan had lost his freedom and his future. Those 17 students had lost their sense of safety. The university had lost a building and its reputation. I wasn't even sure what I'd lost. My ability to trust, maybe. My sense that the world was fundamentally safe and predictable. My naivete about love and relationships. Something essential that I couldn't quite name but knew was gone forever. Sentencing came 6 weeks later in early June. The courtroom was even more packed than before, if that was possible. The judge allowed victim impact statements first. 3 students who'd been hurt in the fire stood up one by one to describe how the trauma had affected them. One girl talked about dropping out of school because she couldn't handle being on campus anymore. Another described the nightmares that hadn't stopped, the therapy that wasn't helping enough. The professor who'd had the heart attack talked about his ongoing recovery and his family's fear that he'd die before reaching retirement. Their words were devastating and powerful, and I could see the judge taking careful notes. Then it was the defense's turn to argue for leniency. They called Declan's mother to testify, and she broke down completely on the stand, sobbing about how her son had been a good boy, how he'd never been violent before, how his depression had gone untreated because their insurance wouldn't cover enough therapy sessions. She begged the judge to consider mental health treatment instead of long-term incarceration. Declan's father testified about family history of mental illness, trying to establish that Declan's actions were symptomatic of disease rather than character. It was emotional manipulation, but it was also genuinely sad. These parents had lost their son to his own worst impulses and now would lose him to the prison system too. Finally, the judge asked if Declan wanted to make a statement before sentencing. His lawyers had probably advised against it, but he stood up anyway. He read from a prepared statement in a monotone voice, saying he was sorry for the harm he'd caused, that he thought about his actions every day, that he understood he'd made terrible choices. He said he'd been in a dark place emotionally and had made terrible choices, but he hoped someday he could do something meaningful with his life to honor the people he'd hurt. His voice cracked several times while reading, and by the end he was openly crying. It might have been genuine remorse, or it might have been strategic emotion designed to influence the judge. Probably it was some combination of both. The judge took a long pause before speaking, reviewing his notes carefully. He said he'd considered all the evidence and testimony, the severity of the crimes, the danger posed to the community, the defendant's mental health issues, and his lack of prior criminal record. He sentenced Declan to 30 years in state prison with no possibility of parole before serving 25 years. Declan would be 46 years old before he could even apply for parole, and given the nature of his crimes, parole would likely be denied multiple times. He'd probably spend the rest of his useful adult life behind bars. His mother collapsed sobbing in the gallery. His father sat with his head in his hands. As bailiffs moved to escort Declan out, he turned one final time and looked directly at me, and I realized with a cold certainty that I would carry his gaze with me for the rest of my life. And the burned building was demolished that summer. The rubble cleared away in a matter of weeks. The university built a memorial garden on the site with native plants and wooden benches, and a bronze plaque listing the names of everyone affected by the fire. I graduated the following spring with honors despite everything that had happened. Isla and I remained close friends, bonded by shared trauma in a way that nothing else could have created. My parents attended the commencement ceremony looking proud and relieved that I'd made it through. During the speeches, the dean mentioned the fire briefly, called it a tragedy that had tested our community but hadn't broken it. Students around me shifted uncomfortably, those of us who'd been there that day remembering things we'd rather forget. I received my diploma and smiled for photos, but I was already planning to move to a different city for graduate school, somewhere without these memories. 5 years later, I was living in Seattle working as a data analyst. My life rebuilt piece by piece into something that functioned, even if it never felt quite normal. I'd been in therapy the entire time, working through the trauma and the guilt and the complicated feelings about Declan. I'd dated a few people, but nothing serious, unable to fully trust anyone enough to let them close. The fire alarm in my apartment building still made me flinch every time it went off for drills. News stories about domestic violence made my chest tight, but I was surviving, building a life that was mine alone, and some days that felt like enough of a victory. Declan was still in prison and would be for another 2 decades at minimum. I'd gotten exactly 1 letter from him after the sentencing, forwarded through my lawyer. I'd never opened it, burned it instead, watching the paper curl and blacken, and felt something like closure in the smoke.